Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to start by firstly acknowledging my co-author Janine Kidston, who's down here in the audience, and depending on what questions you do or don't have for me, I'll bring Janine up to answer the agricultural side of things. So today I'd like to talk about biosecurity concerns relating to the land application of waste. So we're hearing more and more about biosecurity in the media. Well, what does that mean, and what does it mean for the waste industry? So first of all, the definition. Biosecurity is a protection of the economy, the environment and the community from the negative impacts of pests, diseases, weeds and contaminants. And so I suppose you can group animal pests and diseases, animal and plant pests and diseases. It's focused not just on agriculture but also on native flora and fauna. Weeds, I think we're pretty familiar with the impacts of weeds on the environment and also reducing crop production. Contaminants, I confess that when we started interacting with DPI's biosecurity team, I didn't realise contaminants were a biosecurity impact as well. So we're talking about the obvious things like pesticides and heavy metals, but also physical contaminants like plastic and glass, bits of metal, whatnot, and I'll talk a little bit about those things later on. So why do we care? Well, in simple terms, the agriculture sector contributes significantly to the New South Wales economy. So if there was a serious biosecurity impact, that has big flow-on effects to jobs, export markets, and of course food quality. And food is really the heart of the issue because agriculture is about food production. And when we apply, whether it's synthetic fertilisers or waste-derived organics, when we land apply those materials as either a source of plant nutrition or to improve the soil quality, the beneficial nutrients will end up in the food chain, and so will the undesirable things. So it's in all of our best interests. It'll end up on your plate if we don't get it right. It's not just about agriculture, as I mentioned. It's also environmental degradation, anything from species mortality to upsetting the balance of an ecosystem. And then, of course, the public health risk from transmissible diseases. So these are diseases that might affect livestock or native wildlife, and some of those are also infectious to humans. At the severe end of the scale are the emergency animal diseases. So at the moment, Australia's lucky, we're free from all of these diseases. Foot and mouth and mad cow, I'm sure you're familiar with. Scrapie is the same disease as mad cow in sheep. And the last two there are prion diseases. And the reason I'm sure you're not particularly interested in what causes them, but the reason I mention that is that prions are indestructible. And so if there was an outbreak, well, how do we deal with that? We can't destroy them, and the way that DPI manages that issue is making sure that there are management controls in place to break the cycle, if you like, or to stop spread. And so there are controls needed, management controls in land applying wastes to prevent, if there was an outbreak, to prevent the spread, and pictures like that from the UK. So the driver for today's presentation is really that there is new legislation about to become active. So the Biosecurity Act, and this is administered by DPI, it's not an EPA thing. The Biosecurity Act is already on the web if anybody would like to look at that, but it won't become active until the regulation that sits under that is passed through Parliament. That hasn't happened yet, but we expect that'll be pretty soon. So this legislation should be enforced by the end of the financial year. And I guess the important thing to note is that you're probably all familiar with the Protection of the Environment Operations Act and the regulations that sit under that. There's a direct link between the DPI legislation and the EPA legislation. So you can't operate under one or the other, it's both. And that wording is not what will appear in the regulation, but it's the same meaning. If you're applying waste to land, then you need to be operating under both bits of legislation. So to really grasp what biosecurity means for you in the waste industry as processors, generators, consumers, whichever bit you belong to, you need to understand a few key definitions. The first one is biosecurity matter. So that's any part or product of a living thing, disease or disease agent, prion or contaminant. It's very broad. it pretty much captures all the waste that we apply to land. The second one is restricted animal material, or RAM as we refer to it. Now it's any vertebrate product except milk or tallow, gelatin. It includes blood, meat, poultry, fish, feather, bone meal. There's a whole list of things. The really important things to know about RAM are that, first of all, there's a national and enforceable ban on feeding RAM to ruminant animals. So ruminant animals are cows, sheep, goats, deer, there's a few others. And that's nothing new. That's been in place since 1996 in some form or another. So it's been around a while. Farmers know about that. It's not something that most people in the waste industry would have thought about. And the second thing is that there's no treatment or processing that you can apply to material that's got RAM in it to make it not RAM anymore. So if it's RAM to start with, it doesn't matter whether you're doing anaerobic digestion, composting, rendering, whatever the process is, it's still, your outputs are still considered RAM. But that's only an issue if you're applying those organic materials to cropping land, to land where there's animals grazing. So if it's cropping land, RAM isn't the issue. So you can see that those definitions pretty much capture any waste that we apply to land that contains meat or animal products, contaminants, because obviously we don't want residues in food, plant propagules, weed seeds, pathogens and pest species. So I'm going to focus on the organic wastes because they're obviously at the higher risk end of the spectrum. The way we manage waste in New South Wales for land application is through the resource recovery orders and exemptions. They facilitate beneficial reuse of waste. So it has to be of benefit. That's the core philosophy. So we have orders and exemptions for almost all of those wastes. We don't have anything for vermicompost, but that's likely to change in the not too distant future. But all the rest, food waste, we've got several different orders and exemptions that apply, and also there's the things like the on-site rapid decomposition or dehydration units. There's different ways that you can go about applying any of those wastes to land. Some of them contain RAM, some of them don't. Some of them have other biosecurity or potential biosecurity risks. For example, weed seeds in mulch, plastic in compost, chemical contaminants and physical contaminants in some of the others. So how do we deal with that? At this point, you might be think the situation's a little bit grim. How are we going to continue to apply waste to land when clearly all of it is captured by this, all of it contains something that might be a biosecurity impact? Well, the EPA is committed to keeping organics out of landfill where they can be beneficially reused. So we don't see this as a huge issue. We just think that we're certainly going to be reviewing all of our documents to make sure that they're consistent and that they align with DPI's requirements. So there's a bit of update. There will be some change ahead. But many already have some controls. And I think the raw mulch, or now called the mulch order and exemption that we updated last year is a really good example of that. You now need to do a risk management plan, a risk management assessment, which has an assessment of the plant material before it's mulched by somebody who knows what they're doing. If you want to land apply that in an environmentally sensitive area. So that's already taken care of. And there's other things too. We've got chemical and limits on chemical contaminants and physical contaminants in many of the exemptions, and then basic management controls like stock withholding, buffer zones, incorporation with soil. And so there's small things that, we can do to make a big difference, such as fencing off a stockpile of waste that's about to be land applied to keep stock out. So I think, there's change ahead, but they're not insurmountable issues. So I guess just wanted to go through a few examples of where things have gone a bit pear-shaped for landholders. We have been working really closely with DPI's biosecurity team, both the policy people as well as their compliance officers. So this is a recent case from the Southern Highlands where food waste was knowingly deposited in a paddock. So it's not beneficial land application. You can see it's just been dumped in a heap in the middle of the paddock. There's nothing beneficial about that. And there's livestock grazing on it. Now this waste contains numerous things, but amongst other things it contains confectionery, dog food, It has got ram in it, dog food's got meat in it, and the cows are grazing on it. So, that was an interesting one. Some fines were issued. So another example of, well, this illustrates, I guess, the harsh reality for farmers if they're not aware of what they're receiving. This is compost that was land applied on a farm in the northern tablelands. It's full of plastic. There were some other physical contaminants too. I don't know if they were from the compost, but it was fairly dirty looking, and so the farmer had accreditation under the Livestock Production Assurance Scheme run by Meat and Livestock Australia. They did a random audit, and when they saw it, it was, a showstopper, so he lost his accreditation. The cattle are unsuitable for export. But even accreditation aside, this is an issue about consumer confidence and product quality. It's not, even people that don't have livestock for export, they shouldn't be worried about this kind of issue. And finally, the third example is community perception. So this is a site southwest of Sydney where it was actually pasteurised garden organics, not mulch, and there's large pieces of plastic blowing around in a paddock. And so the various members of the community saw this and called the EPA to complain. Why are we land applying rubbish? It's an excellent question. Because this material actually complies with our orders and exemptions if you look at it by weight. So the amount of plastic in there by weight met our limits, but it's in very large pieces. Normally the plastic contamination, incidental contamination in these materials is small, and you don't see it blowing around a paddock like that. But livestock eat, bizarrely, they eat bits of plastic, and so this is a risk, apart from a horrible aesthetic. And so in this case, there's no fines issued or anything like that, but I guess it's just an illustration of getting the processing right at the front end so that doesn't end up in the paddock. So the next steps, I guess, for the EPA we continue to work with DPI and make sure that all of our documents that we use for land application of wastes and the activities that we regulate, that they do align with DPI's requirements and that we're being consistent. Because I think really we're all looking for the same outcome. We want good food production. We don't want to be eating, the negative, undesirable things that might work their way into the food chain. So good biosecurity practice and beneficial resource recovery should deliver that outcome. So where we have healthy landscape and environment all the way through to healthy community. So there's some contact details, but I'm also happy to answer any questions. And if you've got agriculture questions, as I said, Janine is here as well. Thank you.